The popular new movie, The 355, is about a group of international women spies. Did you know that it's named in honor of a real woman who spied for General George Washington during the American Revolution? She is known only as 355. Her identity has been the subject of speculation for years. I even appeared on a couple of TV shows about her, but I didn't agree with either conclusion about who she was. Who was 355 and what did she do? New York City was occupied by British forces from 1776 through 1783. It served as England's forward operating base for the Revolutionary War. Tens of thousands of British and Hessian soldiers moved on and off the island. The highest-ranking commanders lived there. 355 was a woman who moved among them. Not just any woman, but one who had access to the most secret plans of the British command. To find out more about 355 and what New York was like at the time, let's go back in time to the 1770s and take a walk through the occupied city. The story of 355 is one that intrigues all of us. Of course, we all wonder whether it is someone we know. Maybe she's one of our friends or family members. It's so tantalizing to wonder whether the lady sitting next to you at a banquet might have been that daring woman. Of course, we can never really know unless she decides to reveal herself, but it's always fun to speculate. Now, personally, I lived in exile from the city during her time. I can only report what I have learned from others. So let us begin with an understanding of Our Lady's area of occupation, which would have been the city of New York. This map shows all of Manhattan Island. The city of New York is the shaded area at the southern tip. This is where 355 most likely lived and operated. But in a little while, I'll tell you why I think she might have done her most important spying at a distance outside of the city proper. This small area, less than 1 square mile wide, was teeming with soldiers, officers, loyalist residents, slaves, servants, and people who had nowhere else to go. It was crowded with as many as 35,000 people. It was on these streets where we find the places soldiers and their commanders gathered: taverns, coffee houses, shops, the theater, and churches. What things do we know about 355 that will help in our search? She had to have access to someone to pass information on to who was capable of handing it off to General Washington. That person, in turn, had to be able to travel to and from the city. The city was an operating military base surrounded by water on 3 sides and military installations to the north. It was nearly impossible to enter or leave. At the same time, she had access to British officers who would have had critical information in their possession. This meant those officers, members of England's aristocracy, considered her one of their class. She was a lady, not just any ordinary woman. Our Lady was trusted by both sides. This map shows the route taken to move intelligence out of occupied New York to Setauket on the north shore of Long Island by members of the Culper Spy Ring. The Culper Ring was run by Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, originally from Setauket, a town that was also under British occupation. Talmadge ran a spying operation that began in his hometown of Setauket. His friend, Abraham Woodhull, was called Culper. In New York, gathering information for Talmadge was Culper Jr., Robert Townsend. Townsend was an established New York merchant with family based in Oyster Bay, another town on the north shore of Long Island. His family home and farm were also under British occupation. Moving between the city was a courier, most often another friend from Setauket, Austin Rowe. But sometimes Woodhull made the trip himself into the city, posing as a farmer selling goods to the British. When he got to the city, he stayed at Underhill's boarding house, owned by his sister and her husband. For a time, Townsend lived at Underhill's, so it wouldn't be too out of line to propose that 355 left her intelligence there or made contact with someone there. Colonel Talmadge kept an extensive code book that assigned numbers to people, places, and common words. Here you can see the section that lists the codes for Culper, 722, Culper Jr., 723, Austin Rowe, 724, and Talmadge, who was codenamed John Bolton, as well as other operators in the ring. Each member had a copy of the code. No one here is designated as 355, but a search of Talmage book shows this. Here we see the number 355 means lady. It doesn't refer to a specific person, but a specific type of person, a lady. Notice here is the code for woman, 701. So 355 was someone known to be entitled to be called a lady. Over the years, I've tried to get my friend, Colonel Talmage, to elaborate on the identity of this mysterious lady. Like all honorable gentlemen, he has sworn secrecy to his death and tells me it is up to her to reveal herself if she desires. It's also possible that Colonel Talmage did not know her identity, only that a lady was passing information on to another member of the ring. This would help ensure her identity remained a secret. The fewer who knew it, the more protected she was. It was Colonel Talmage, though, who explained to me that Lady 355 is not the same as woman 701. Knowing that, where might we find her? A place to start might be St. Paul's Chapel. On Sundays, the town's officers would be found here among the crowd attending morning services. Our Lady might be one of many sitting in the boxes chatting with the unmarried gentlemen. Maybe a walk through the graveyard or down the broad way on a warm, sunny Sunday. There's been a fair amount of conjecture that 355 was one of the women to be found in many of the city's taverns and brothels. My friends, I honestly doubt it. Although we know the men, and many of them the finer men, spent time in brothels, remember what the codebook hints to us. Our 355 is a lady, not an ordinary working woman, servant woman, slave woman, actress, or harlot, although some people believe the latter two to be the same. She is not 701, but 355. Let us continue on our journey into the city. Before we go any further, I realize I've left out a very important bit of knowledge about Our Lady 355. Forgive me, I grow more absent-minded as the years go by. I simply assumed you already knew. 355 did not pass on just any common information to General Washington. She passed on vital clues about a traitor in the general's command. And there was only one British officer from whom she could have learned it. Major John Andre. Yes, that Major Andre. Charismatic, a talented artist, popular, handsome, and very scheming. Major Andre was Colonel Talmage's counterpart. He ran a spy ring for British commander Sir Henry Clinton. Also known for throwing magnificent parties like this one in Philadelphia, with everyone dressed like knights and ladies. This is a self-portrait of him wearing a costume he designed. It was while he was in Philadelphia that Major Andre met a popular socialite, Miss Peggy Shippen. This picture of Miss Shippen was drawn by Major Andre himself. Indulge me for a moment of gossip. It was said that Miss Shippen was the most beautiful young woman out in society in all of America. Of course, this is impossible. Everyone knows that the most beautiful women of all shapes, sizes, and complexions are to be found here in New York. Well, Miss Shippen and Major Andre became good friends, and after he was removed to New York, they continued to correspond. Shortly after, Miss Shippen became Mrs. Arnold. Yes, Mrs. General Benedict Arnold. I suspect you know where my story is leading. Of course, this is the story of the evil treason committed against his own country by the most vile Benedict Arnold. It was through his friend, now Mrs. Benedict Arnold, that Major Andre was able to reach out to General Arnold and entice him to switch sides. This is the vital bit of information that 355 passed through the Culper Spy Ring to General Washington. But at first, she knew the identity of the turncoat only as Gustavus. My friends, Gustavus was the code name by which Arnold was known to Andre. This, I believe, puts Our Lady into very close, intimate proximity to the Major. Well, where would we find Major Andre? The Major was a regular here at the John Street Theater. It's known that he was friendly with some of the actresses and invited them to his gentlemen's parties. Also known as the Hellfire Club, but I will leave that for another time. 355 might have also attended the theater and perhaps even with Major Andre, but there would be no talk of Gustavus here. We would likely see Major Andre here at Queen and Wall Streets in the most crowded part of the city. stopping at Mulligan's Tailor Emporium to get fitted for clothes, and a meal at his reserved table at Rivington's coffee house, blending in with the other officers, gentlemen, and ladies crowding the streets. 355 might have seen Major Andre regularly in this neighborhood, but to learn about Gustavus, she had to have seen his private papers, and there's only one place where that might have happened, his home. During the occupation, Major Andre took up residence in the Beekman Mansion. Beekman Manor is 6.5 miles north of the city. It looks out over the East River and is a long way from town. 355 was likely able to travel easily from the Beekman Mansion into the town to drop off her intelligence. Perhaps she lived in a country house somewhere in between and was often seen going back and forth so that the sentries on duty never suspected her. Still, it was very dangerous. The mansion was where Andre kept his correspondence and code book. It was only here in his private bedroom that the letters between him and Gustavus would be found. Well, this puts our 355 in a very delicate position. May I propose that it was likely she spent time in the parlor and had, on occasion, the opportunity to sneak into Andre's bedroom. She must have had the utmost trust of the major because she had to have done this multiple times. The first message she sent through the Culper Ring only referred to Gustavus. Clearly, it sent a panic through the ranks, but neither Washington, Talmadge, or any of the other commanders had the slightest idea who Gustavus might be. But eventually, 355 figured out that Gustavus was General Arnold and sent her final shocking message. Gustavus is Arnold. Alas, it was received too late. Her message was handed to General Washington while he was at West Point to inspect the very fort of which Arnold was the commander. It was just a short time after Arnold's treachery was revealed and he fled to safety. If her message had only been a day earlier, how things would have been different. The traitor Arnold would have hanged, as was his due. Instead, he and Peggy lived freely in England, and 355 disappeared as quietly as she arrived. And Major Andre, well, surely you know of his fate. He was captured after meeting with Arnold, found guilty of spying by a military court, and hanged. Now that we've examined the facts of what happened, who might be 355? Let us start with some popular speculations. The first is Mrs. Elizabeth Bergen. Mrs. Bergen aided dozens of colonial soldiers in their escape from New York military prisons, but she was eventually suspected and fled the city. After reuniting with her children in Philadelphia, she was awarded a pension by General Washington in return for her service in saving the lives of his men. Mrs. Bergen is to be revered for her courage, but there is no reason to believe she had any contact with the Culper Ring or even Major Andre. Therefore, I do not believe it was her. It seems impossible to believe, but some have even suggested that it was Mrs. Peggy Shippen Arnold who turned in her own husband. This, I believe, is ridiculous. Mrs. Arnold would not have wanted to live the rest of her life as a traitor's wife, despised everywhere. Indeed, it is the result she obtained, although by intrigue of another kind, her correspondence with Major Andre. Another opinion has it that Mrs. Anna Strong of Setauket was 355. It is suspected that the code 355 did, on occasion, refer to her, and she did at times accompany Mr. Woodhull on his trips into the city. But may we be candid? Mrs. Strong was not the type of woman we might find in the company of Major Andre, who, it is well known, commanded the company of the most beautiful and desirable young ladies or socialites in New York. Mrs. Strong is a fine lady in her own right, but not the type to be dallying around with Major Andre. But I do have an opinion as to who 355 might have been, and in my mind, the most likely candidate is Mrs. Robert Watts, the former Miss Mary Alexander, daughter of General William Alexander, also known as Lord Sterling, and one of General Washington's closest confidants and friends. Mrs. Watts is also the niece of William Livingston, governor of New Jersey, her mother's brother, an outspoken leader of the rebellion. She is cousin by marriage to John Jay, married to Livingston's daughter Sarah, an honored diplomat during the war and member of the Continental Congress. On the other hand, she is married to Robert Watts, the son of John Watts, a wealthy Loyalist merchant. Mary, by the way, is named for her grandmother, Mary Sprott Prévost Alexander, a highly respected merchant and my own mentor. It was Mrs. Alexander who, when I was a young lady learning my father's business, helped me learn the ways of success. I have been friends with the Alexanders all of my life. Impossible as it might be to believe, Mrs. Watts stayed in New York during the occupation and was allowed unfettered access to her mother by way of letter writing. Mrs. Alexander and her younger daughter, Kitty, even paid a visit to the occupied city. I know it sounds incredible that British officials would allow the wife of one of our finest generals into their base to see her daughter, but it is indeed true. During that visit, as Mrs. Alexander told me, various city officials and officers did their best to trick her into accepting very expensive gifts. It was obviously an attempt to compromise her in a way that could be publicized to drive a wedge between Generals Washington and Sterling. During that time, she accepted nothing without paying and expressed to me the constant discomfort she experienced knowing what they were up to. Mrs. Watts, being the daughter-in-law of John Watts, one of the city's wealthiest Loyalists, was a lady whose company was highly valued. And being the daughter of Lord Sterling, she was equally sought after in the hopes that she might be turned against her father in a way that would bring useful information to the British. How intriguing to think that it was she, while at various social events at Major Andre's home, found the intelligence regarding Benedict Arnold. Mrs. Watts was perfectly positioned, trusted by Major Andre and other commanders, and as the daughter of General Sterling, trustworthy in the eyes of Colonel Talmadge and the Culper Ring. With her wealth and private carriage, she could easily travel from Beekman Manor to the city without notice. It is Mrs. Watts, the former Mary Alexander, who I believe is the most likely candidate to be 355. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my speculation on the identity of 355. If so, please like the video and share it, and subscribe for more videos like this about the American Revolution. Until next time, I'm Mrs. Q.